A series of protests and blockades in Canada against COVID-19 vaccine mandates and restrictions, called the Freedom Convoy by organizers, began in early 2022. The initial convoy movement was created to protest vaccine mandates for crossing the United States border, but later evolved into a protest about COVID-19 mandates in general. Beginning January 22, hundreds of vehicles formed convoys from several points and traversed Canadian provinces before converging on Ottawa on January 29, 2022, with a rally at Parliament Hill. The convoys were joined by thousands of pedestrian protesters. Several offshoot protests blockaded provincial capitals and border crossings with the United States. In late 2021, both Canada and the U.S. accommodated unvaccinated cross-border truckers by exempting them from COVID-19 vaccine requirements in order to prevent exacerbating existing supply chain disruptions. The exemptions in Canada ended on January 15, 2022, and the U.S. exemption ended on January 22, 2022. Of the 120,000 Canadian licensed truck drivers who regularly serve cross-border routes, approximately 85% were already vaccinated against COVID-19 by January. An estimated 12,000 to 16,000 Canadian truckers could be affected. Protesters occupied the downtown core of Ottawa and stated that they would not leave until all COVID-19 restrictions and mandates were repealed. Officials expressed concern about the economic impact of border blockades. On February 11, Ontario Premier Doug Ford declared a state of emergency, introducing new legal sanctions on the impediment of trade routes, highways, airports, ports, bridges and railways. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and U.S. President Joe Biden spoke on February 11 to discuss ending blockades at the border. On February 14, Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time since its passing in 1988. Between February 17 and 20, a large joint operation police presence in Ottawa arrested organizers and protesters, removed parked vehicles, and dismantled blockades from Ottawa streets. By February 21, most of the protesters had been cleared from Ottawa. The convoy was condemned by trucking industry and labor groups. The Canadian Trucking Alliance stated that most protesters had no connection to trucking. Near a blockade in Coutts, Alberta, multiple weapons were seized and 4 men charged with conspiracy to commit murder of Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers. Officials raised concerns of some protesters' involvement with far-right extremist groups, including those promoting violence, and that some protesters called for the federal government of Canada to be overthrown. Some sources have called the protests an occupation or a siege. On the political front, Trudeau and New Democratic Party leader Jagmeet Singh condemned the convoy, while many members of Parliament from the Conservative Party of Canada endorsed the convoy. Republican politicians from the United States and conservative politicians and media figures around the world also endorsed the convoy. Multiple opinion polls showed that a majority of Canadians opposed the convoy, while a minority supported the convoy. Background. Protest goals. The protest called for the end of vaccine mandates in Canada during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Freedom Convoy spokesperson Ben Dichter stated on Fox News that we want to get rid of the vaccine mandates and the passports. And that passport, that's the really concerning one. The organizers of the original mid-January crowdsourced fundraising campaign on GoFundMe, Tamara Lich and Dichter, both of whom are not long-haul truckers, described the goal of the truck convoy from all across Canada to the nation's capital, as a demonstration against the newly implemented January 15 federal cross-border COVID-19 vaccine mandate, targeting long-haul truck drivers, according to a January 28, 2022 CTV News article. As the convoy reached Ontario, it attracted a coterie of hangers-on and they used their moment in the sun to detract from its original goals. Several protesters voiced opposition to perceived authoritarianism and corruption by Justin Trudeau, stating they wanted him out of office, while others said, "This is not an anti-vaccination movement, this is a freedom movement." For example, Canada Unity's Ontario organizer for the convoy Jason LaFace said that the intent of the Canada Unity protest was to dissolve the federal government. Many of the restrictions that the protesters objected to are under provincial jurisdiction. Planning. One of the main organizers behind the convoy, Canada Unity, acknowledged that they had planned to submit their signed Memorandum of Understanding to the Senate of Canada and Governor-General Mary Simon, described in the memorandum as the SCGGC. The memorandum, which was signed by James Botter, his wife Sandra and Martin Broadman, was posted on the Canada Unity website in mid-December 2021 and publicly available until its February 8 retraction. Botter, whose name is at the top of a CTV News list of major players in the convoy, is the founder of Canada Unity. CTV cited Botter saying that he hoped the signed memorandum would convince Elections Canada to trigger an election, which is not constitutionally possible. In this pseudo-legal document, CU called on the SCGGC to cease all vaccine mandates, reemploy all employees terminated due to vaccination status, and rescind all fines imposed for non-compliance with public health orders. If this failed, the memorandum called on the SCGGC to dissolve the government, and name members of the CU to form a Canadian Citizens Committee, which is beyond the constitutional powers of either the Governor-General or the Senate. The original memorandum contained no specific mention of cross-border truckers as it had originally been drafted and delivered over a month earlier, but then was reissued for the protest. By February 8, there were 320,089 of the 1 million signatures on the memorandum Canada Unity had hoped for. A February 8 article in The Guardian, on how the convoy was the result of coordination between QAnon, conspiracy theorists, unprecedented coordination between various anti-vaccine and anti-government organizations, including Botter's vow that the protesters would remain until all their demands were met. Organizers felt a groundswell of fresh support for the MOU could trigger a new federal election, and investigations into Prime Minister Trudeau. When questioned in a February 3 Power and Politics interview by a CBC reporter, on whether he would negotiate with the core organizers' knowing purpose as stated in the memorandum, Conservative MP Kevin Waugh dismissed the memorandum as nonsense, saying the organizers are frustrated like many Canadians in this country. Tom Marazzo, a self-declared spokesperson for the protest and an ex-military officer, held a press conference on February 7, proposing the formation of a coalition with the Conservatives, NDP, and Bloc Québécois. American influence. Fundraising. Donor list hacked. Vaccine mandates and passports. In late November 2021, during the fifth wave of the global COVID-19 pandemic, the highly contagious Omicron variant doubled in less than 2 days, resulting in an extremely high number of patients requiring hospital care. In a February 11 Bloomberg News interview with Canadian Labour Minister, Seamus O'Regan, Amanda Lang said that a lot of the mandates being protested here are provincial mandates. O'Regan clarified that jurisdiction is clearly laid out in our Constitution, which describes the separation of powers and jurisdictional mandates and authority at federal, provincial, and territorial levels. O'Regan said that Canadians were already tired after 2 years of the pandemic, with some even struggling. Christmas lockdowns prevented many family reunions, yet most Canadians followed health protocols. There were only 13% of Canadians who were unvaccinated as of January 12. In the province of Quebec, the unvaccinated accounted for 50% of hospitalizations by February 7. Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Theresa Tam, reported that the average daily case count had increased by 65% since the previous week, with a daily average of 42,000 new cases. Some provincial and territorial governments imposed tougher lockdowns to attempt to slow the spread. By the time cases began to decline in late January, an estimated 20 to 25% of Canadians had been infected. In January, the number of new Omicron infections had peaked, according to a February 4 Public Health Agency of Canada announcement. A January 27, 2022 CTV News explainer provided an update on current vaccine mandates and public health restrictions across Canada as background for the convoy. These mandates and restrictions fall under provincial and territorial jurisdiction and most are not federal responsibilities. Regulations regarding international borders are reciprocal, they are enacted and enforced by both countries who share the border, involving federal agencies including Transport Canada, and in the United States, Homeland Security and CDC. Under the Constitution Act, health is the responsibility of the provinces and territories. The federal government transfers public funds to the provinces and territories to ensure Medicare is universally accessible. 81 COVID-19 related responses, including those related to vaccinations, like all healthcare in Canada under the Canada Health Act, are the responsibility of provinces and territories who provide free health services in their own jurisdictions. There were no mandates or passports until the fourth wave when the highly contagious Delta variant spread rapidly across Canada. By mid-August 2021, there was an emerging patchwork of vaccine mandates, including those implemented by private facilities. As most of the deaths caused by COVID-19 at that time were among seniors, private long-term care facilities began to mandate vaccinations for staff by late August. In the first lawsuit against an employer who mandated vaccinations, on November 9, 2021, the arbitrator, Von Vett, upheld the company's mandatory vaccination policy, and dismissed the grievance. At the federal level, dialogues were undertaken with other group of 7 nations, the World Health Organization, and the International Civil Aviation Organization regarding passports' reliable and secure proof of vaccination credentials. Vaccination requirements for U.S.-Canada cross-border travel. Convoy to Ottawa. The first convoy departed Prince Rupert on January 22, arriving in Prince George in the evening. The following day, another convoy left from Delta with supporters gathering along Highway 1, the Trans-Canada Highway. On January 24, a convoy drove through Regina, Saskatchewan, and was greeted by supporters. According to police in Regina, about 1,200 vehicles reached the city. On January 25, another convoy passed through Kenora, Ontario, where Ontario Provincial Police in contact with the convoy stated that 200-300 vehicles would be passing through Kenora. The convoys consisted of 3 main routes across Canada, which would converge for the Ottawa protest on the weekend. The Ottawa Police Service estimated up to 2,000 demonstrators in the city on the weekend. As of January 26, the OP estimated approximately 400 vehicles had entered Ontario from the Manitoba border as part of the eastbound convoy. The Kingston Police estimated approximately 300 vehicles to go through Kingston. On January 27, David Aiken, a reporter for Global News, tweeted that a convoy that had arrived that day in Thunder Bay from Winnipeg consisted of 113 commercial vehicles and 276 personal vehicles, citing the OP. Winter weather closed a portion of Highway 17, in northern Ontario, causing the eastbound convoy to be divided. Some of the truckers continued on to Sault Ste. Marie, while others diverted to Highway 11 and drove toward Cochrane. Also on January 27, a fatal crash occurred near Chatham, Ontario. OP officers later identified the convoy movement as a contributing factor to the incident. Truckers from the Maritime provinces planned to meet in Moncton before departing for Ottawa. On the morning of January 27, supporters gathered in Enfield, Nova Scotia, where fireworks were set off as 10 to 15 trucks departed for the New Brunswick border. RCMP in Pay reported that approximately 70 trucks and supporters' vehicles crossed the Confederation Bridge into New Brunswick, but that most immediately turned around and returned to the island. About 24 trucks reportedly passed through Fredericton in the afternoon, bound for Ottawa. On January 27, one convoy group passed through the Greater Toronto area. Hundreds of protesters gathered at highway overpasses in support of the convoy. On January 28, a convoy was seen passing through Quebec. About 600 convoy vehicles were expected to stay the night in Arnprior before heading to Parliament Hill the following morning. On January 28, the province of Nova Scotia banned gatherings along highways, specifically on the Trans-Canada between the Nova Scotia and New Brunswick border, in relation to protests related to the Freedom Convoy. Ottawa protest. Peak size of Parliament Hill demonstration. According to the Ottawa Police Service, crowd estimates ranged from 5,000 to 18,000 protesters on January 29, dwindling to approximately 3,000 demonstrators the following day. By February 1, they estimated as few as 250 protesters remained. On February 9, CNN's Daniel Dale fact-checked numerous claims about the protests in general. Dale echoed the previous claims by police, adding that there was also an estimated 200 vehicles from the Atlantic provinces. Some Facebook posts claimed as many as 50,000 trucks would be participating in the convoys. On his blog, Fox News commentator Sean Hannity reported that the convoy was made up of 10,000 heavy trucks, and Joe Warmington of the Toronto Sun reported that the event may set a Guinness World Record for the largest truck convoy on record. These claims were grossly exaggerated. Claims that the truck convoy made the Guinness Book of World Records are also false. The current record is 480 trucks, set in Cairo, Egypt in 2020, and the Freedom Convoy did not submit an application for an attempt at setting a new record. Desecration and community harassment. Various images of specific acts during January 29 received wide condemnation. Protesters were seen drinking and dancing on the tomb of the unknown soldier at the National War Memorial. Chief of the Defence Staff General Wayne Eyre described it as a desecration, and the Royal Canadian Legion condemned the actions. A statue of cancer fundraiser Terry Fox was decorated with an upside-down Canadian flag and a protest sign. The Terry Fox Foundation said Fox believed in science and gave his life to help others. Images of a Canadian flag marked with a swastika were seen, as were Confederate flags. The statue was cleaned later by other protesters. Some protesters harassed volunteers at a local soup kitchen, the Shepherds of Good Hope, demanding free food intended for Ottawa's homeless population. The kitchen tweeted, "One member of our shelter community was assaulted by protesters. A security guard went to his aid and was threatened and called racial slurs." Its press release said trucks were towed after blocking its ambulance drop-off zone for around half a day. Ottawa protests and entrenchment. A Globe and Mail article entitled "Officials Condemn Desecration of Monuments, Hateful Signs on Display at Trucker Convoy Protest" also described the January 29 protest as having a party-like atmosphere with some handing out coffee, cookies, drinking beer and smoking marijuana. Ottawa police reported de-escalating multiple high-risk situations, making no arrests. According to the Daily Hive, protesters barbecued food, played hockey, and set up bouncy castles for their children to play in. The Canadian Trucking Alliance commented on January 29 that many of the supporters at the protest in Ottawa had no direct connection to the trucking industry. On January 30, Ottawa police launched a criminal investigation into the desecration of the National War Memorial and statue of Terry Fox. They will also be investigating threatening/illegal/intimidating behavior toward police officers, workers, and other private citizens. Also on January 30, Ops Chief of Police Peter Slowly said, I think the only thing we can say for sure, we're still going to be dealing with some level of traffic disruption and demonstration over the next 24 hours. During this first weekend of protest in Ottawa, the city's COVID-19 wastewater signal indicated a sharp increase in COVID-19 cases, suggesting a possible link between the gathering of protesters and the spread of COVID-19. A January 31 press conference was held at an undisclosed location, open only to invited right-wing outlets. The House of Commons resumed on January 31, after the holiday break. On January 31, Ottawa paramedics announced that protesters had thrown rocks at an ambulance over the course of the weekend and called paramedics racial slurs. Paramedics had treated 19 people over the course of the weekend, mostly due to alcohol-related intoxication. On the afternoon of January 31, slowly said that the situation of the demonstration has scaled down over the last 12 hours and that we want that trend to continue until this demonstration comes to a complete end. I cannot guarantee you that right now, but I can guarantee that every effort at negotiation, coordination, de-escalation, has continued throughout the last 4 days and will continue until the complete end of this demonstration. On February 1, large downtown Ottawa amenities like Rideau Centre and the National Arts Centre continued to stay closed due to security concerns. Ottawa police set up a hotline for hate-motivated crimes to be reported. On the night of February 1, Ottawa police said that about 250 protesters remained around and on Parliament Hill. A video circulated showing protesters appropriating First Nations drumming while dancing, drinking beer, and chanting Yabba Dabba Doo and Fuck Trudeau. Senator and Mi'kmaq leader Brian Francis tweeted, "I am disgusted, appalled, and saddened. This blatant act of racism must be vehemently condemned by all. Drumming is sacred to all First Nations. Our ways of life should never be mimicked, mocked, and appropriated for political or other gain." The Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nation, whose traditional unceded territory includes the city of Ottawa, issued a statement condemning protesters who held an Indigenous pipe ceremony and set up a teepee in the city's Confederation Park without the First Nations' permission on February 2. On February 2, organizers of the protest said that they would not leave Ottawa until governments across Canada end all mandates associated with COVID-19 and will stay as long as it takes for freedom to be restored. On February 3, the protesters started building a wooden structure in Confederation Park and gathering fuel supplies. Social media reports suggested that the structure is intended to serve as a community kitchen for the protesters. On February 6, Ottawa police promised to increase enforcement on protesters, including handing out tickets and arresting anyone who attempts to bring material aid, such as fuel, to protesters. A state of emergency was declared by the City of Ottawa on the same day. In a statement, the city said that its declaration reflects the serious danger and threat to the safety and security of residents posed by the demonstrations and highlights the need for support from other jurisdictions and levels of government. On the evening of February 6, police performed a raid on a stockpile hub of supplies for protesters, seizing fuel and making 2 arrests for mischief. An emergency debate of the House of Commons was held on the night of February 7, at the request of NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. Trudeau stated that the convoy is trying to blockade our economy, our democracy, and our fellow citizens' daily lives. It has to stop. Transport Minister Omar Al-Gabra used the debate to encourage Ontario Premier Doug Ford to use regulatory powers to discourage the occupation, such as suspending commercial licenses or insurance of the truckers. As of February 7, the Children's Aid Society was working with the OPS to ensure the welfare and safety of the children who are living in about 25% of the 418 convoy trucks, according to Ottawa Police Deputy Chief Steve Bell. Concerns were raised about sanitation, noise levels, and fumes. According to the Canadian press, there were about 100 children living in the convoy trucks as of February 8. Bell said that the presence of children is an important factor complicating a challenging operation. By February 9, people with police, military, and survivalist experience had helped the protesters set up camp with tents and wooden kitchens, creating a supply chain to ensure continued protest. The logistics center at the Raymond Shabu Grant Thornton Park Baseball Stadium includes trailers of food, tents, toilets, and distribution points for gasoline and propane. The Freedom Convoy's head of security and spokesman is Daniel Bulford, a former RCMP officer who served on Prime Minister Trudeau's security detail. Police on Guard, a Facebook group of about 100 police officers, mainly retired, and 50 soldiers endorse the convoy. 2 serving members of the Joint Task Force 2 are under investigation for alleged involvement. On February 10, leaders of the Freedom Convoy declared February 11 an Orange Shirt Day and called for student walkouts to end COVID-19 restrictions in schools. Indigenous leaders condemned this announcement as misappropriation. On day 15, February 11, Doug Ford declared a state of emergency in Ontario as protesters continued to occupy the Ambassador Bridge, while Ford referred to the situation in downtown Ottawa as a siege. By February 12, police had cleared trucks from the bridge, with busloads of police, some with heavy weapons, and an armored vehicle. By day 14, February 10, the newest tactic was convoy circles. Ottawa Centre MPP Joel Harden noted that a convoy organizer had been encouraging protesters to form them around public schools in Ottawa. A group of about 60 convoy vehicles headed to the Ottawa Macdonald Cartier International Airport at 8 a.m., slow circling it, honking and blocking traffic until about 10 a.m., then returned to their Coventry Road, one of 3 Ottawa protest encampments. Chief Stoley said many vexatious calls from the United States to 9-1-1 flooded the system and endangered lives. Mayor Watson sent a letter to Tamara Lich and Keith Wilson to negotiate terms with protesters. On February 13 afternoon, Mayor Watson's office said that they had reached an agreement with protesters limiting the protest perimeter to Wellington Street, between Elgin Street and the Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway to reduce pressure on residents and businesses. Truckers will leave residential neighborhoods. On February 15, Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly resigned after weeks of criticism aimed at his handling of the protests. After clearance, organizers Chris Barber and Tamara Lich were each arrested on February 17. Lich's bank account had previously been frozen. Organizer Pat King was later arrested on February 18, and an Alberta woman in the convoy, Carrie Comox, offered $50,000 for bail. The Crown lawyer noted that allowing her to act as surety was like one thief being tasked to supervise another burglar. Comox was listed as the co-creator of a crypto donation platform. King was denied bail on February 25, after the presiding justice ruled that Comox was not suitable surety, and expressed concern that King had a high risk of reoffending. On February 28, a convoy leader from High Prairie, Alberta named Tyson Freedom George Billings was denied bail. Various nearby rural areas became new encampments for the protesters. More than 50 trucks moved to a truck stop in Champlain Township, near Van Cleek Hill, immediately following the Ottawa clearance. In interviews, those at the site mentioned plans to continue the convoy, with no specifics. Sites have also opened in Trent Lakes and near Kinban, in West Carleton March Ward. As of February 17, 2022, a farm in Russell Township, outside of Embrun, continued to be used by truckers as a convoy base camp. The Ontario Provincial Police is monitoring the site. As of February 20, the site near Kinban remained active. Prime Minister Trudeau has commented, saying the groups were showing a desire or an openness to return. A few days before February 21, a convoy from Fort McMurray, Alberta was turned away at the Manitoba border. At a special meeting of the Ottawa Police Services Board on February 24, Acting Chief Bell feels the Highway Traffic Act and other laws would be enough to manage a possible return, despite removal of the Emergencies Act. On March 5, a human chain was formed along Wellington Street, as a freedom protest. Some later relocated to the Ottawa Carleton Detention Centre, demanding Litch and King be released. Ottawa residents protested the delayed police response. On March 26, a convoy demonstration from Quebec made what police called a symbolic passage through downtown Ottawa on its way to Van Cleek Hill. Major blockades. Alberta, Montana. On January 29, the date that the Freedom Convoy arrived in Ottawa, a group of truckers blockaded the Sweetgrass-Coutts border crossing, one of the busiest ports of entry west of the Great Lakes, which connects Sweetgrass, Montana, via U.S. Interstate 15, with the village of Coutts, Alberta, via Alberta Highway 4. The United States Department of Agriculture's Food Safety and Inspection Service is located at this crossing, making it the principal port of entry for Alberta's large meat industry, and one of three main points where all meat products from the rest of Western Canada cross the border, according to the Canadian Meat Council. The group of around 100 protesters demanded an end to all COVID-19 restrictions. The blockade, which extended about 2 kilometers into Canada, also blocked public and emergency vehicle access to the village of Coutts, prompting condemnation from the town's mayor. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney called the blockade illegal, and threatened that protesters would face penalties under the province's Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. Alberta RCMP initially negotiated with protesters for a peaceful end to the blockade, and protesters agreed to release about 50 vehicles trapped on Highway 4 and U.S. Interstate 15. On February 1, police ceased negotiations and demanded that protesters leave the highway, and set up a police roadblock on Highway 4 about 20 kilometers north of Coutts. A few vehicles left, most remained, and several incidents of violence against police and civilians were reported, including protesters ramming RCMP vehicles. Some vehicles wanting to join the blockade evaded the RCMP roadblock by driving through a ditch and drove south in the highway's northbound lanes, resulting in a head-on collision. The two men involved in the collision were taken to hospital. On February 12, due to ongoing protests, the Canada Border Services Agency suspended all travel at the Coutts border crossing. On February 14, RCMP stepped in and arrested 13 people, seizing long guns, handguns, body armor, a large amount of ammunition and high-capacity magazines. 4 men were subsequently charged with conspiracy to murder RCMP officers. The border crossing was reopened on February 15. Ontario, Michigan. Protesters at the Ambassador Bridge, connecting Windsor, Ontario, with Detroit, Michigan, and one of the busiest international border crossings in North America, blockaded the border crossing on February 7. On the evening of February 7, movement at the bridge came to a complete halt. The blockade continued into February 8. On the morning of February 8, officials declared the bridge reopened, but the blockade resumed, pushing trips to the Blue Water Bridge connecting Sarnia and Port Huron. Supply shortages caused by the blockade led to work shortages at Ford Motor Company's assembly plants in Oakville and in Lansing, Michigan, and shut down its Windsor plant. Parts manufacturers for Chrysler were also shut down, and on February 10, Toyota revealed that its 3 Ontario plants could not produce vehicles for the rest of the week. The Bank of Canada warned that the blockade could have a measurable impact on the Canadian economy. The Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society condemned protesters for using children as human shields during the protest. On the morning of February 12, aided by Ontario Provincial Police and the RCMP, Windsor Police began to clear out the blockade using new powers. Despite the heavy police presence, by the end of the day on February 12, most protesters remained, although had been pushed much further from the bridge. Police arrested 2 individuals, towed 7 vehicles and issued 11 tickets. On the morning of February 13, joint police forces took control of the area and began to make arrests. In the late evening of February 13, the Ambassador Bridge had fully reopened. 42 arrests were made in total, with 37 vehicles seized. Windsor police requested resources from other police organizations on February 9, 2022, after the number of participants climbed to around 100, with between 50–70 vehicles. Windsor, Ontario, where the convoy blocked the Ambassador Bridge, intervened in an action by automobile manufacturers in Superior Court for an injunction. Mayor Drew Dilkens declared his intention to clear the bridge with the assistance of police reinforcements. An injunction was granted February 11 effective 7 p.m. A deadline of midnight was set. Local police were to be employed to clear the bridge. At 9 a.m., police from several Ontario cities, including London, Ontario, were at the bridge in force together with buses and tow trucks, an armoured personnel carrier, and a sniper. The Windsor police announced via Twitter that enforcement had begun. Some protesters, after discussion with police, had peacefully departed with their vehicles. The police, from Windsor and 5 other jurisdictions, succeeded in clearing the area of tractor-trailers, but a large crowd gathered in the area. The crowd was peaceful, even festive, singing the national anthem, but the bridge remained closed. The police maintained a strong presence in the area, but did not attempt mass arrests. In the evening 1 arrest was made. The protesters were completely cleared by February 13 at approximately 8 a.m., although the border was not immediately opened. The bridge reopened Sunday evening with 25 to 30 people arrested and 12 small vehicles seized. There was a substantial police presence and jersey barriers were installed to keep the 3-mile-long access road to the bridge open. On February 16, police intercepted a convoy of 6 or 7 trucks 250 kilometers away from Windsor heading towards the city after leaving Ottawa. Participants and response groups. In the lead-up to the planned arrival in Ottawa, it was reported on January 25 that far-right and white supremacist groups were hoping for violence on Parliament Hill akin to the 2021 United States Capitol attack. This has caused organizer Tamara Lich to address convoy members and denounce political violence, saying that protesters should hold a peaceful protest instead. Organizers and leaders of the convoy condemned extremist groups, and asked that participants report lawbreakers to the police. They also stated that any extremists found would be removed from the convoy. Despite this, some protesters were photographed waving Nazi flags at the rally. The Globe and Mail noted that signs comparing vaccine mandates to the persecution of Jewish people by the Nazis remained until the clearance. On January 28, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau expressed concern that a small group of protesters are going to be posing a threat during the weekend. One of the lead organizers of the convoy, James Botter, has previously stated support for QAnon, endorsed conspiracy theories about the COVID-19 pandemic and the 2020 U.S. presidential election, and called for the arrest of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for alleged treason. On February 3, 2022, Romana Dijallo arrived in Ottawa with supporters. Dijallo, a conspiracy theorist linked to QAnon who calls herself the Queen of Canada, had called in November 2021 on her 73,000 Telegram followers to shoot healthcare workers administering COVID-19 vaccines. An episode of the Faulkner Focus, hosted by Harris Faulkner, was criticized by the Daily Beast in February 2022 for trying to normalize the protests and anti-vaccine sentiment. The episode said that the protesters were not a fringe minority, but represented the mainstream of society and had international support. The montage of protesters she showed prominently displayed imagery relating to QAnon. The Facebook page for the convoy has shared content from, and listed as an organizer, the Wixit co-founder and Yellow Vest Canada organizer Patrick "Pat" King, who has previously hosted counter-protests to anti-racism rallies, spread COVID-19 misinformation, and spread the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. In December 2021, while talking about COVID-19 public health measures, King said the only way this is going to be solved is with bullets. On February 8, King falsely claimed that 50% of the Ottawa police force have all turned in their resignation today. Tamara Lich, the protests fundraiser, is secretary for the Maverick Party, a Western Canadian separatist group formerly known as Wixit Canada. Lich was previously the regional coordinator for Wixit in southeastern Alberta and a board member for Wixit Alberta. The Maverick Party denied involvement with the convoy on January 24. Action for Canada, which is associated with the Canada Unity Group inside the Freedom Convoy, has been called an Islamophobic and anti-LGBTQ hate and conspiracy group. It hosts web pages about the dangers of political Islam, health consequences of 5G technology, and the alleged underreporting by the mainstream media of adverse reactions to the vaccine. Action for Canada appears to have been founded by Tanya Gaw, who actively supported the Yellow Vests protests of 2019. Jason LaFace, Canada Unity's Ontario organizer and official representative to the Freedom Convoy, is also a main organizer for No More Lockdowns Canada, an anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine mandate organization primarily associated with expelled Ontario MPP Randy Hillier. No More Lockdowns Canada holds anti-lockdown rallies across Ontario. Benjamin Dichter, who is listed as an organizer on the Freedom Convoy's GoFundMe page, was a speaker at the inaugural 2019 People's Party of Canada National Convention, and has claimed political Islam has infiltrated the Conservative Party of Canada and is rotting away at our society like syphilis. Convoy leader Dave Steenberg has posted material by Soldiers of Odin, a neo-Nazi vigilante group, on his Facebook page. Jason LaFace, an administrator of the Convoy Facebook page, has done the same thing. LaFace has also posted a photo of himself wearing a Soldiers of Odin jacket. Following the seizure of weapons, ammunition, and body armor at the blockade in Couts, one piece of body armor was identified to have patches signifying relation to accelerationist right-wing militia diagram Olan. Counter-protesters. Counter-protests in favor of public health measures were held throughout the convoy's duration. In Ottawa, with protesters in the Parliament area spilling into residential neighbourhoods, lawsuits and injunction requests were filed by residents. Counter-protests were held in several cities on February 5. Counter-protesters forced a convoy of vehicles to split up in Vancouver. Some 200 people gathered in front of Ottawa City Hall to demand the end of disruptions caused by trucks downtown. People held pro-vaccination signs in Whitehorse while anti-mandate protesters passed them in vehicles. A counter-protest organized by healthcare workers was planned in Toronto for February 12, but was called off when the provincial government instituted a state of emergency. In counter-protests on February 12, thousands of people joined the Community Solidarity March through Ottawa to demand the end of the protests. On February 13, a group of Ottawa residents blocked the intersection of Riverside Drive and Bank Street to prevent a newly arrived contingent of vehicles from joining the main protest. The original group of 20 grew to more than 1,000 people and successfully kettled the eastern artery of the blue-collar convoy for 8 hours and were joined by groups in other neighborhoods. The convoy vehicles left one at a time under a heavy police escort after the vehicle owners took down their signs and flags. Throughout, various individuals gained public note for their counter-protesting. The protesters' Zello push-to-talk style voice channels were the subject of coordinated disruption from counter-protesters, including users playing the homoerotic country rock song Ram Ranch to troll participants and listeners. Law enforcement response. Ottawa Police Service response. Integrated Command Center response. Plans for the creation of the new Integrated Command Center were in place by February 12. The Integrated Command Center was created to help Ottawa Police Services coordinate with Ontario Provincial Police and RCMP when the anticipated reinforcements would arrive. As an estimated 4,000 protesters converged on Parliament Hill on February 12, the extra reinforcements requested by Chief Slowly a week earlier had not yet arrived. Emergency Preparedness Minister Bill Blair said on February 13 that they are in constant contact with provincial and municipal authorities. Because the situation is critical for Canada with the closing of our borders, the targeting on critical infrastructure, particularly our points of entry by the people behind these protests, it poses a significant national security threat to Canada, and we have to end it. On day 19 of the protests, with Ottawa under 3 states of emergency invoked by the 3 levels of government, Chief Slowly resigned. At the February 15 Ottawa Police Board meeting, Deputy Chief Steve Bell, who was appointed interim Chief of Police, told the board that the ops force had not yet received the 1,800 extra officers requested. At the height of the protests there were about 8,000 protesters. Overnight on February 14 there were less than 150 people in the blockade and approximately 360 vehicles still on the streets, in contrast to the estimated 4,000 vehicles at the end of January. The ops had made a total of 33 arrests and charged 18 people in the 19-day period. Canadian Police Association President, Tom Stamatakis, cautioned that with Slowly's resignation, politicians should not scapegoat him for other failures that have allowed this occupation to drag on. On February 18, day 22, hundreds of ops, York, Toronto, Gatineau, Durham Region, London, Hamilton forces, the Sûreté du Québec, the OP, and the RCMP, worked on a coordinated police action in and around Parliament Hill. By late February 18 morning, CTV News and other mainstream media reporting in the red zone showed police steadily, very slowly sandwiching groups of dozens of the remaining protesters on all sides on separate streets. There were reports of a flank of police on horseback behind those in the front lines. Families with children were seen in these final groups of protesters, with police reporting that protesters were putting children between their operations and the protest site. The police assured that children will be brought to a place of safety. In a CBC interview with Charles Bordelou, former ops chief, he said he had never seen children used before in other protests. He said that the CA did not have to step in. Pat King was arrested near noon. King is described as the final of 3 major online influencers continuing the protest to be arrested. He was later charged of mischief, counseling to commit the offense of mischief, counseling to commit the offense of disobey court order, and counseling to commit the offense of obstruct police. By early afternoon, tactical officers began slowly entering the cabins of large rigs that had been parked in front of Parliament since the end of January. 2 large campers placed by protesters to prevent large trucks blocking Sussex from moving were finally cleared early in the afternoon, with the arrest of a protester in the motor home by 5 officers wearing full security gear. Police allowed mainstream media close access to the front lines of the tactical method. In the afternoon, as some of the remaining protesters accepted the inevitable, they began to clear 30 centimeters of snow from their trucks and trailers in preparation for their departure. Frustrated protesters interviewed by CBC and CTV, who were earlier calling "Hold the Line," asked for their voice to be heard. The last few protesters said without evidence that the protest was legal, citing, but misunderstanding Canadian law. CBC News on the front lines reported protesters in the red zone, who could leave but choose to stay and be arrested. There were 70 arrests and 21 vehicles were removed by mid-afternoon. CBC senior defense writer, Murray Brewster, described the police operation as professional, methodical, and tactical. Police did not prevent truckers or individual protesters from driving or walking away for most of the day. They may face charges later. Police used a minimal amount of force even late in the afternoon as members of different forces began squeezing the group of protesters even tighter on Wellington Street in front of Parliament. They were not wearing shields or using pepper spray or tear gas, as they wanted protesters to leave, as opposed to arresting them, according to Bourdaloue. As waiting long lines tow trucks, brought in by the police, replaced the heavy rigs that had been gridlocking Ottawa downtown, some of tow truck company names were hidden. CBC reported that tow truck companies who had previously refused to tow protesters' vehicles, have been forced through the Emergencies Act to comply with orders. Bourdaloue also said that the Emergencies Act had allowed police to set up 100 checkpoints around the city of Ottawa to prevent protester backfilling and to prevent pop-up protests. In response to those who contrasted the February 18 coordinated successful response to the Ops inaction in previous weeks, Carol Ann Meehan, an Ottawa city councillor, said that the Ops had been severely under-resourced until the Emergencies Act was invoked. On February 19, police began with a hard, fast push towards the encampment at Parliament Hill. Due to the resistance of protesters, police wore helmets and batons for protection. At one point, a smoke device was released by protesters. By early afternoon, more than 140 people had been arrested and dozens of vehicles had been seized. During the question period of the Ops press conference, Chief Bell confirmed that security forces have been gathering intelligence using videos, and that they will be actively pursuing people who have been filmed. The police will actively follow up with identifications, collect evidence, seek criminal charges with sanctions can include the financial level and licensing level. Clearance. Municipal response. Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson described the situation as the most serious emergency our city has ever faced. Provincial response. On February 11, Ontario Premier Doug Ford declared a state of emergency in the province. On the same day, Ontario Superior Court granted an injunction to remove protesters from the Ambassador Bridge. The injunction was sought by multiple industry groups affected by the blockade including the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. On February 23 at 5 p.m., Ontario ended the state of emergency. Federal response. Emergencies Act. Related events. Other border crossing obstructions. British Columbia, Washington. Manitoba, North Dakota. Other Canadian protests. Toronto. Winnipeg. Fredericton. Nova Scotia. Edmonton. Other. International protests. The Freedom Convoy also inspired several Facebook and Telegram groups organizing similar protests in 34 countries including Argentina, Austria, Cyprus, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. As is the case in Canada, demonstrations were partly supported by local far-right groups, in Finland by members of neo-fascist Blue and Black movement, Soldiers of Odin and Power Belongs to the People, and in Germany by the Reichsbürger movement and Alternative for Germany. In February 2022, a solidarity protest was organized in the United Kingdom with a convoy driving from Scotland to London with stops in cities throughout the British Isles. Other convoys were reported in Wales and parts of England. Officials in Paris and Brussels banned protests relating to the Freedom Convoy, following information from organizers of a similar event opposed to France's Health Pass, Le Convoi de la Liberté, that 5 convoys from across France were due to reach Paris between February 11 and 14. French police used tear gas to disperse protesters, in addition to intercepting hundreds of vehicles and issuing hundreds of fines to those participating in the convoy. On February 23, a group of American truckers began a solidarity protest convoy from California to Washington, D.C. called the People's Convoy. In response, the Pentagon approved the deployment of 700 unarmed National Guard troops to D.C. In early March, a demonstration was held by convoy protesters in D.C. near the Washington Monument, but only a small number of people attended. One convoy called the U.S. Freedom Convoy was scheduled to arrive in D.C. on March 1, but disbanded when only 5 trucks arrived in Las Vegas from Los Angeles. Also in early March, more than 1,000 large trucks, recreational vehicles, and cars gathered in the outskirts of D.C. as part of the People's Convoy protest. A website for the protest said that they will not enter D.C. proper. However, one participant who described himself as the lead trucker said that he would drive his truck into the city. After 3 weeks of protesting, on March 27, People's Convoy CO organizer Mike Landis announced that the convoy would leave D.C. and drive back to California. On May 20, 2022, the People's Convoy disbanded and declared victory despite never re-entering D.C. as planned. Several smaller splinter groups formed in the aftermath of the disbandment, such as the 1776 Restoration Movement. Rolling Thunder Ottawa. A motorcycle convoy of hundreds is scheduled to enter Ottawa on April 29. The group's route intends to stop at the National War Memorial and Parliament Hill. Looking to avoid a repeat of the previous convoy, Ottawa Police announced that vehicles would not be allowed near the hill. Ottawa Police are to be joined by members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Ontario Provincial Police, and various municipal police services. Up to 831 RCMP are available as special constables. The Royal Canadian Legion distanced itself from the protest, stating in part the Legion defends these sacred sites of remembrance, and asserts that they should never be used as a backdrop for any other agenda beyond the act of remembrance. Our hope and appeal to all who may gather before the National War Memorial this weekend is that they do so with a focus purely on remembrance. A large crowd gathered on Rideau Street in the evening, in front of Rideau Centre. After an escalation of crowd aggression, police with helmets and shields were deployed. An attempted to occupy a parking lot was overturned. In total, 7 people were arrested on the first evening. A professor who studies the dynamics of protests counted less than 1,000 people at the rally, including police and journalists. A counter-protest, described as an unwelcoming party, was held by locals at Strathcona Park. Saturday's planned events include a rally at Parliament Hill featuring COVID-19 conspiracy theorist Christopher Sakachia, widely referred to as Chris Sky. Rolling Thunder's organizer, Neil Sherd, has attempted to distance himself from Sakachia. Another group, Ottawa Unity Chain, intends to form a human chain. It claims to have collaborated with Sherd's group. Results and aftermath. Parliamentary Committee investigations. The House of Commons committee structure lent itself to ongoing investigations, in the Canadian House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance and the Canadian House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security and the Canadian House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Early in March 2022, a special joint committee on the declaration of emergency of the Senate and the House of Commons was struck to investigate the events associated with it. FINA Committee, SECU Committee, PROC Committee, DEDC Committee, Rouleau Inquiry. Economic loss and costs. On February 15, there were reports that the blockage of the Ambassador Bridge could result in costs to the automobile industry representing approximately $1.2 billion in the economies of both the United States and Canada. The director of the University of Waterloo's Cross-Border Institute stated to CBC News that the economic loss from the Ambassador Bridge blockade was between $3 billion and $6 billion. Every day, vehicles and auto parts valued at approximately $141.1 million flow across the bridge. Major auto manufacturers were forced to pause production, automakers and their suppliers were having to scramble to get parts to plants on time for the current week's run. A previous estimate by BBC on February 12 said that the estimated total cost to the automobile industry was about $600 million. Experts say that the economic effects will be felt by the auto industry and others for weeks. The demand for vehicles is strong even with prices at record highs, but dealers' lots remain empty. Reuters reported, citing IHS Markit's data, that the estimated loss by February 14 to the auto industry alone could be as high as $850 million. 25% of the value of all U.S. Canada goods trade pass over the Ambassador Bridge daily, approximately $360 million in both directions a day. During the first week alone, businesses in the downtown Ottawa, including the city's busiest and largest shopping mall, the Rideau Centre, lost nearly $20 million in the first week alone, according to the Retail Council of Canada. In Ottawa, Alberta, Montana. On January 29, the date that the Freedom Convoy arrived in Ottawa, a group of truckers blockaded the Sweetgrass-Coutts border crossing, one of the busiest ports of entry west of the Great Lakes, which connects Sweetgrass, Montana, via U.S. Interstate 15, with the village of Coutts, Alberta, via Alberta Highway 4. The United States Department of Agriculture's Food Safety and Inspection Service is located at this crossing, making it the principal port of entry for Alberta's large meat industry, and one of three main points where all meat products from the rest of Western Canada cross the border, according to the Canadian Meat Council. The group of around 100 protesters demanded an end to all COVID-19 restrictions. The blockade, which extended about 2 kilometers into Canada, also blocked public and emergency vehicle access to the village of Coutts, prompting condemnation from the town's mayor. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney called the blockade illegal, and threatened that protesters would face penalties under the province's Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. Alberta RCMP initially negotiated with protesters for a peaceful end to the blockade, and protesters agreed to release about 50 vehicles trapped on Highway 4 and U.S. Interstate 15. On February 1, police ceased negotiations and demanded that protesters leave the highway, and set up a police roadblock on Highway 4 about 20 kilometers north of Coutts. A few vehicles left, most remained, and several incidents of violence against police and civilians were reported, including protesters ramming RCMP vehicles. Some vehicles wanting to join the blockade evaded the RCMP roadblock by driving through a ditch and drove south in the highway's northbound lanes, resulting in a head-on collision. The 2 men involved in the collision were taken to hospital. On February 12, due to ongoing protests, the Canada Border Services Agency suspended all travel at the Coutts border crossing. On February 14, RCMP stepped in and arrested 13 people, seizing long guns, handguns, body armor, a large amount of ammunition and high-capacity magazines. 4 men were subsequently charged with conspiracy to murder RCMP officers. The border crossing was reopened on February 15. Ontario, Michigan. Protesters at the Ambassador Bridge, connecting Windsor, Ontario, with Detroit, Michigan, and one of the busiest international border crossings in North America, blockaded the border crossing on February 7. On the evening of February 7, movement at the bridge came to a complete halt. The blockade continued into February 8. On the morning of February 8, officials declared the bridge reopened, but the blockade resumed, pushing trips to the Blue Water Bridge connecting Sarnia and Port Huron. Supply shortages caused by the blockade led to work shortages at Ford Motor Company's assembly plants in Oakville and in Lansing, Michigan, and shut down its Windsor plant. Parts manufacturers for Chrysler were also shut down, and on February 10, Toyota revealed that its 3 Ontario plants could not produce vehicles for the rest of the week. The Bank of Canada warned that the blockade could have a measurable impact on the Canadian economy. The Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society condemned protesters for using children as human shields during the protest. On the morning of February 12, aided by Ontario Provincial Police and the RCMP, Windsor Police began to clear out the blockade using new powers. Despite the heavy police presence, by the end of the day on February 12, most protesters remained, although had been pushed much further from the bridge. Police arrested 2 individuals, towed 7 vehicles and issued 11 tickets. On the morning of February 13, joint police forces took control of the area and began to make arrests. In the late evening of February 13, the Ambassador Bridge had fully reopened. 42 arrests were made in total, with 37 vehicles seized. Windsor Police requested resources from other police organizations on February 9, 2022, after the number of participants climbed to around 100, with between 50–70 vehicles. Windsor, Ontario, where the convoy blocked the Ambassador Bridge, intervened in an action by automobile manufacturers in Superior Court for an injunction. Mayor Drew Dilkens declared his intention to clear the bridge with the assistance of police reinforcements. An injunction was granted February 11 effective 7 p.m. A deadline of midnight was set. Local police were to be employed to clear the bridge. At 9 a.m., police from several Ontario cities, including London, Ontario, were at the bridge in force together with buses and tow trucks, an armoured personnel carrier, and a sniper. The Windsor Police announced via Twitter that enforcement had begun. Some protesters, after discussion with police, had peacefully departed with their vehicles. The police, from Windsor and 5 other jurisdictions, succeeded in clearing the area of tractor-trailers, but a large crowd gathered in the area. The crowd was peaceful, even festive, singing the national anthem, but the bridge remained closed. The police maintained a strong presence in the area, but did not attempt mass arrests. In the evening 1 arrest was made. The protesters were completely cleared by February 13 at approximately 8 a.m., although the border was not immediately opened. The bridge reopened Sunday evening with 25 to 30 people arrested and 12 small vehicles seized. There was a substantial police presence and jersey barriers were installed to keep the 3-mile-long access road to the bridge open. On February 16, police intercepted a convoy of 6 or 7 trucks 250 kilometers away from Windsor heading towards the city after leaving Ottawa. Manitoba, North Dakota. Criticism of Ottawa police. In response to criticism that police had been too soft on disruptive protesters, on February 1, Chief Slowly said that it was a measure of success that there were no riots, no injuries, no deaths. By February 4, Ottawa Police's response to the protests and later encampments of lingering protesters drew criticism from local residents. Complaints focused around lack of enforcement on noise due to constant horn honking, disruption of livelihoods and continued gridlock. Police later addressed some concerns by issuing 30 tickets on February 3. Criticism has also focused on the sharp contrast between the occupiers' reception and the ways police forces all over Canada treat Black and Indigenous people, who are violently policed for existing in public space, let alone protesting. On February 4, Ottawa Police hired Navigator Ltd., a crisis public relations firm to aid in handling messaging to the public. By February 13, on day 17, Federal Minister Blair urged the police to do their jobs, enforce the law and restore order. Police enforcement of layers of laws, injunctions, and emergency orders already in effect was minimal, which further emboldened protesters on Ottawa's downtown core. On day 19 of the protests, February 15, Slowly resigned as chief of the Ottawa Police Service. Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino announced that the RCMP and OP would assume control of the situation in Ottawa. On February 16, Ottawa City Councillor Diane Deans was removed by Council as chair of the police board, in a 15-9 vote. Councillors described the board as ineffective in oversight, and were critical of the hiring of an interim chief without consultation. Hiring is something the Ontario Police Services Act allows them to do, and the choice had received support of the Ontario Solicitor General. A vote to remove Councillor Carol Ann Meehan from the board failed. Councillor Ralston King resigned from the board during the meeting. A citizen vice chair resigned earlier in the day. 6 investigators and 2 forensic investigators from the Special Investigations Unit are investigating 2 incidents involving the police. The first is an incident on Friday, at about 5:14 p.m. on Rideau Street and Mackenzie Avenue involving a Toronto Police Service officer in the Mounted Police Unit and a 49-year-old woman, who has a reported serious injury. There is a now debunked but widely spread online rumor that a woman had been trampled by a horse and killed. The family of the woman said that she is alive and is recovering from a broken clavicle. This was also confirmed by paramedics. On Saturday, at about 7:18 p.m. Vancouver Police Department officers discharged anti-riot weapon Enfields at individuals in the area of Sparks Street and Bank Street. The Ottawa Police Services Board unanimously supported a motion on February 24, for the Ontario Civilian Police Commission to open an investigation into the response to the protest. From an Access to Information request, emails between the National Capital Commission and Ottawa Police Services revealed that law enforcement overall was hampered by poor communication, disagreement on approaches and tactics, and confusion over jurisdiction. Criminal investigations. Active investigations are underway for a number of widely publicized incidents, including those related to the Unknown Soldiers Memorial and the Terry Fox statue, as well as for more general incidents, including bribery, threats, assault, dangerous driving, and setting a fire in a building. An ops hotline has been set up where victims can report crimes, including hate crimes. Chief Slowly warned offenders that if they had come from elsewhere and committed a crime, including hate crime in Ottawa, there have been intelligence officers, investigative officers, and multi-jurisdictional support from across Canada at work in the background. He said that no matter where you live, no matter where your vehicles are registered, you will be investigated. We will look for you. We will charge you, if necessary, will arrest you, and we will pursue prosecutions against you. On February 7, some 24 arrests were made, and nearly 80 criminal investigations had begun. On March 21, a 21-year-old Ottawa man unrelated to the protest was charged in connection with the fire. On April 6, a 41-year-old Ottawa man, also unrelated to the protest, was similarly charged. Lawsuits. On February 4, 2022, Ottawa human rights lawyer Paul Champ filed a $9.8 million class action lawsuit against Chris Barber, Benjamin Ditcher, Tamara Litch, Patrick King, and others as organizers of the Freedom Convoy on behalf of downtown Ottawa residents over continuous air horn and train horn noise. The lawsuit is seeking $4.8 million for private nuisance and $5 million in punitive damages. In response to the suit, convoy organizers agreed to cease horn noise until 1 p.m. on February 6. Many protesters ignored the agreement. The lawsuit went to court on the afternoon of February 5 and a hearing was adjourned to February 7. On February 6, Champ posted an ultimatum to protesters in Ottawa that they would be released from the lawsuit if they left Ottawa by 10 a.m. EST on February 7. On February 7, Ontario Superior Court of Justice Hugh McLean issued a 10-day injunction on vehicles from honking their horns in downtown Ottawa. By February 17, the claim had expanded to include a class of businesses and was then at $CDN $306 million. Union 613 and Happy Goat Coffee were added as plaintiffs. On February 18, as part of a class action civil suit against the Freedom Convoy organizers, an Ontario Superior Court judge has frozen as much as $20 million under a Mareva order that targets cryptocurrency, raised for the convoy protests in Ottawa. Paul Champ is the lawyer for the plaintiffs, residents of downtown Ottawa. The Mareva injunction is separate from the federal government's efforts to work with banks to have accounts frozen. The injunction freezes convoy donations which could eventually be redistributed to residents who are including in the suit. Statements and reactions. Canadian politicians. Liberal Party. Conservative Party. Other Canadian politicians. American politicians and media figures. Multiple Republican politicians and media figures endorsed the Freedom Convoy, including U.S. Senators Marsha Blackburn, Ted Cruz, Steve Daines, and Rand Paul, U.S. Representatives Jim Banks, Dan Bishop, Lauren Boebert, Ken Buck, Madison Cawthorn, Paul Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jim Jordan, Kevin McCarthy, Chip Roy, Steve Scalise, Governor Ron DeSantis, Kay Ivey, former U.S. President Donald Trump, former Governor Mike Huckabee, former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, TV personalities Donald Trump Jr., Lara Trump, and singer Ted Nugent. Fox News personalities Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, and Laura Ingraham expressed support for the protesters in broadcasts. Former United States Ambassador to Canada Bruce Heyman criticized American groups' support and funding of the protests. On February 10, U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg and Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas contacted their Canadian counterparts, recommended the use of Canadian federal powers, and offered the support of the Departments of Transportation and Homeland Security. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer stated of the convoy, "It's hitting paychecks and production lines. That is unacceptable." On February 11, President Joe Biden met virtually with Prime Minister Trudeau to discuss the resolution of cross-border blockades. According to CBC News, while the Democrats and the White House said almost nothing about Trudeau invoking the Emergencies Act, the Republican ecosystem sprouted thickets of indignation. Carlson called Trudeau Canadian dictator Justin Trudeau and ran the headline, "Trudeau has declared Canada a dictatorship." Facebook stated that they had removed fake users that were set up in overseas content farms in Romania, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, which were promoting the convoy protests in Canada. After this announcement, New York Democratic Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney questioned Facebook as to the number of the accounts, when they were identified, and how many impressions they had on U.S. and Canadian users, comparing it to Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. elections. In a letter to Zuckerberg, Maloney cited that one Bangladeshi firm was responsible for attracting more than 170,000 members to some of the largest Freedom Convoy organizing groups on Facebook. After Ottawa was cleared, conservative commentator Candace Owens called for American troops to be sent to Canada to deal with the tyrannical reign of Justin Trudeau Castro. Alt-right personality Mike Cernovich described Trudeau as a fascist. Trucking industry and labor groups. In their February 7 statement, Teamsters Canada, representing more than 55,000 professional drivers, including approximately 15,000 long-haul truck drivers, of whom 90% are vaccinated, said that the protest serves to delegitimize the real concerns of most truck drivers today. The statement said that the convoy and the despicable display of hate led by the political right and shamefully encouraged by elected conservative politicians does not reflect the values of Teamsters Canada. On January 25, the Canadian Trucking Alliance, a truckers' trade association, and the federal government issued a formal statement reinforcing the use of vaccinations, along with other public health measures, to protect Canadian healthcare and to reduce COVID-19 risk. In the statement, the CTA and the government committed to working together to respond to supply chain constraints. A January 29 CTA statement cautioned the public that a great number of protesters have no connection to the trucking industry and have a separate agenda beyond a disagreement over cross-border vaccine requirements. CTA's January 22 statement had announced that they do not support and strongly disapprove of any protests on public roadways, highways, and bridges and the disruption of the motoring public on highways and commerce at the border. CTA members can express their disagreement with government policies by holding an organized, lawful event on Parliament Hill. Stephen Laskowski, CTA president, said the trucking industry must adapt and comply with this mandate. The Private Motor Truck Council of Canada noted concern about the convoy's racist remarks, citing the comparisons to Nazis and communism. The Atlantic Provinces Trucking Association and the British Columbia Trucking Association both criticized the protest. The Canadian Labour Congress called the protest in Ottawa an occupation by an angry mob trying to disguise itself as a peaceful protest. Various trucking companies have tried to distance themselves from the convoys, claiming that the vehicles are owner-operated, despite featuring their logos. Mass media outlets. According to the New York Times, in an increasingly polarized political environment, the Canadian truckers became an instant cause célèbre. In late January, CBC host Neil Koksal pondered that there is concern that Russian actors could be continuing to fuel things as this protest grows. But perhaps even instigating it from the outset. However, in October 2022, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service said that no foreign actors had funded or supported the convoy protests. According to Local Journalism Initiative, ethnic media outlets exhibited a variety of reporting and reactions to the protests. Omni Punjabi highlighted the Punjabi truckers who were stuck on the U.S. side of the border for days. Additionally, reporting noted that most Punjabi truckers are vaccinated, as vaccine coverage in the Punjabi community is high. Their priorities are around road safety, snow clearance, road maintenance, as well as working conditions and wage theft. Rich Lowry of Politico argued that the embrace of the Canadian trucker protesters by the American right is a sign that the Tea Party spirit circa the early Obama years was never fully extinguished. Since then, everything has changed. Most importantly, the rise of Donald Trump and his movement, and nothing has changed. It is freedom that remains the most natural and powerful Republican rallying cry. Others. Canadian scholar Peter McLaren criticized the convoy protesters' concept of freedom as sorely lacking in dialectical analysis, arguing that they often limited their analysis to the blanket assertion that freedom means the right to say no to any government restrictions on vaccinations, especially those impeding their ability to cross national borders, in this case, crossing freely between Canada and the United States. McLaren also argued that their concept of freedom is historically linked to settler colonialism, that is, a form of colonialism grounded in exogenous domination, a form of colonialism that seeks to displace the original population of the colonized territory with new groups of settlers who typically justify such colonization through an identification with imperial authority. General Wayne Eyre, Canada's Chief of the Defence Staff, said he was sickened to see protesters dance on the tomb of the unknown soldier and desecrate the National War Memorial, after video of such events surfaced online January 29. In late January 2022, Elon Musk tweeted Canadian truckers rule and followed it up with, "If you scare people enough, they will demand removal of freedom. This is the path to tyranny." Musk also tweeted, "If Canadian government is suppressing peaceful protests, that's where fascism lies." On February 17, Musk tweeted a meme comparing Justin Trudeau to Adolf Hitler, using a meme sympathetic to Hitler. The tweet was later deleted. Musk had previously tweeted a meme on January 30 making fun of people who invoke Hitler during political discussions, saying, "Everyone I don't like is Hitler, a child's guide to online political discussion." The American Jewish Committee condemned Musk's tweet and demanded an apology from him. The Auschwitz Memorial also condemned Musk's tweet. Barry Prentice, transportation economy professor at University of Manitoba, stated that the truckers should be treated differently than flight crews or passenger train employees, and that the positive aspects of vaccine mandates should be evaluated against the disruptions they would cause to the freight industry. English comedian Russell Brand released a video decrying the media for ignoring reporting on the protest. Brand also said in the video that truckers, who were previously regarded as heroes when they were delivering vital goods and working during the lockdown, are now villains as they protest vaccine mandates. Krista Haynes, daughter of Ontario Premier Doug Ford and active anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine campaigner, attended a rally in support of the truckers as they headed to Ottawa. Former President of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, praised the protests, tweeting, "Violent crackdown on Freedom Convoy 2022 has nothing to do with freedom of speech and human rights. How coercion could be related to liberty and freedom of choice." Signing off with Truckers for Freedom. Great Barrington Declaration. CO author Martin Kulldorff tweeted in support of the protests. According to the Washington Examiner, psychologist and conservative commentator Jordan Peterson offered a message of congratulations and caution to the convoy. The Terry Fox Foundation condemned the defacing of Fox's statue with anti-mandate signs. The Royal Canadian Legion called protesters dancing on the tomb of the unknown soldier shocking and strongly condemn their actions. On February 12, as a convoy passed through Charlottetown, a lone veteran stood guard at the cenotaph outside Province House to prevent the same disrespect of the monument. The Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies denounced the use of Nazi symbols by some of the protesters. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms provides legal support of the convoy and its contacts with media. On February 12, Facebook removed anti-vaccine, pro-convoy Facebook groups that were run from Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Romania. Singer and activist Bill Fries, whose song Convoy was used as a rallying cry for the movement, gave his implicit approval for the use of the song in that manner, and was pleased that the movement had caused an uptick in interest in the song. In the final interview he gave before he died. Durham Regional Police Service Constable Erin Howard, who made a video while in uniform in her squad car supporting the protesters and later posted it online in January, was suspended and faced 6 charges under the Police Services Act, including discreditable conduct and insubordination. Her first court hearing was held over Zoom on May 5, 2022, with the proceeding then being adjourned until June 2022. Some members of the political left were initially hesitant to criticize the convoy because the truckers were often described as a working-class movement. Opinion polls. In a Abacus data survey of 1,410 Canadian adults, undertaken before the protest turned into an occupation, between January 31 and February 2, 2022, 68% stated that they had very little in common with the demonstrators and their ideology, and 32% of respondents stated that they had a lot in common with the protesters and their worldview. Furthermore, 43% of respondents stated that they felt the protest was respectful and appropriate, while 57% viewed it American Samoa offensive and inappropriate. A study by Vox Pop Labs among a randomly pre-selected sample of 2,339 respondents, conducted between January 4 and 10, 2022, found that around 70% of Canadians were willing to support a general vaccine mandate for all non-exempt adults over the age of 18, while around 30% disagreed. A routine political poll by Ledger in Canada questioned respondents on the protest between February 4 and 6, 2022, and found that it was opposed by 62% of respondents, with 47% strongly opposing it. 32% supported it, while 7% were unsure. On its subsequent questionnaire, a further 65% expressed the belief that the convoy represented a small minority of selfish Canadians, 57% viewed it American Samoa not about vaccine mandates and pandemic restrictions but rather an opportunity for right-wing supremacist groups to rally and voice their frustrations about society, and 52% likened it to the 2021 United States Capitol attack. Opposition to the convoy was highest among respondents living in urban areas, those vaccinated for COVID-19, and those aged 55 and up, while support for the convoy was highest among the unvaccinated, respondents aged 18 to 54, and respondents living in Alberta. A poll by Maru Public Opinion found that 64% of Canadians polled would support the aid of the Canadian Armed Forces to tow trucks from the protests, and 53% of Canadians polled would support the use of force by Ottawa Police to clear out Ottawa protesters. An Angus Reid Institute poll released on February 14 found that 72% of Canadians polled thought that it was time for protesters to go home. They have made their point. The poll also found that 65% polled believed Trudeau's response has worsened the situation, and 42% said opposition leader Candice Bergen's response has worsened the situation. A Nanas research poll commissioned by CTV News and released on February 25 found that 51% of Canadians polled thought the protests were ineffective, 15% thought they were somewhat ineffective, 20% thought they were somewhat effective, 12% thought they were effective, and 2% were unsure of the protests' impact. An Economist/YouGov poll conducted from February 12 to 15 found that 80% of Americans had heard of the convoy protests. The poll also found that 44% of Americans opposed the convoy protests, while 40% supported them. Among Republicans, 71% supported the convoy protests, compared to 18% of Democrats.